we need to talk concretely about how this evidence can be translated into pricing and coverage considerations so that hopefully, if you remember that bubble on that earlier slide, we can do so in a way that really does foster sustainable access to high-value care for all patients, both for this treatment, if we can get it to be high value, and certainly for other treatments as well. So I just wanted to start with going back to Stephanie again. Have we said all that we really need people to know about the relative advantages of sub-Q versus IV, or the other ways that payers and others looking at the evidence should factor in what value looks like for patients on the ground?
Yeah, I think you have. Just going patient preference. If a patient wants to do IV, then I think they should be able to choose to go IV. If they want to do sub-Q, then I think they should have the choice to choose sub-Q. I think talking with their doctors, they know what's best for them and their family. So I think giving the patient the choice would really benefit the patient and their family.
Okay. Is there anything, I was just curious, we had one topic where we heard from college students that the ability to take a drug with them overseas was a huge advantage in their lives. I assume, again, the portability of being able to take a sub-Q treatment could be a major factor for patients, certainly in certain parts of their life.
Yeah. I have traveled with both IV and sub-Q, and I've never had any problems going through airport, being questioned about my medicine or anything like that. So
okay, so the IV, because it doesn't have to be especially refrigerated or anything, it's just as portable. You can travel overseas, put it in your carry-on, all that kind of stuff?
I would assume so. I've never traveled overseas, but here within the United States, I've never had any problems with either form. I actually do travel with my on-demand therapy, even though I've never had a breakthrough attack. I don't want to be away without having it, and I've never had any problems with needles or anything like that.
Okay, great. And by the way, for the CTAF panel, if you guys have specific questions or comments you'd like to make sure you put up your tent cards, because when I wheel around to look at you, I'll try to find it quickly. Jeff?
Yeah, Stephanie, I'm curious. What you just mentioned brings up something. This is not a common condition. If you happen to be in, North Poughkeepsie and you end up with an attack and you have to go to an emergency room, if you don't have your stuff with you, would they be able to treat you, or would they not be able to? That might be a real advantage to preventative, which is that, maybe it's not available everywhere. I just don't know.
I know it's not available everywhere. I work in a small community hospital, and we have no treatment available. If someone were to come in with hereditary angioedema, know that they have it, and they don't have their drug, we would have to either get medicine shipped into us or ship that patient out. Knowing our policies and that goes on at our hospital, we would most likely transfer them down to University Hospital just because we don't have it, and it would be quicker for them to go to that facility than to have drugs shipped into that ER. So.
Okay. Marco. Let me turn my back to everybody else so I can see you, actually. So there are going to be a lot of questions that we discuss here, and many of them will relate to how insurance companies will design the specific criteria for which patients should get different treatments and how much of it and all that kind of thing. But often those questions circle back to what the clinical experts or the clinical community thinks is appropriate or best care. And people look for guidelines or other kinds of consensus statements to help guide that thinking. My understanding is that there really isn't much in terms of what clinical specialists have said that would help define, for instance, the number of attacks or the severity of the attacks that would make a patient eligible for prophylactic therapy, a good candidate for prophylactic therapy. I'm not sure that clinical experts have weighed in on using both lanadelumab and a C1 esterase inhibitor at the same time if you're having difficulty controlling a patient's attacks. Are there international or other groups that are quickly working on these guidelines or not?
Well, there are several guidelines, as you know, and but the issue of switching from on-demand to to long-term prophylaxis has never been clarified in any of the guidelines. It always raises a lot of controversial, and there is not an agreement among expert among expert and patients association and so on. There is no trial that can actually help in orienting the choice between one and the other treatment. One trial or one study could be to measure or to define some specific endpoint and see if this endpoint is reached from with one or the other treatment. I would think that, for instance, you could the distribution of efficacy is different based on the frequency of the attacks. Mm-hmm. And if you have on one side a certain amount of treatment, and on the other side a certain amount of suffering, and considering that treatment is something that at some point is always giving some additional risk compared to no treatment. And of course, is giving also some advantage. I think that one way to orient, and this is easy when you are on, for instance, on the C1 inhibitor, is to consider the amount of C1 inhibitor that you're using for on demand. And when this amount somehow approaches the amount which is used for a long-term prophylaxis, this is the time when you switch from one to the other. Of course, this is not something that has been approved or has been agreed among different physicians, but is what has been done, for instance, in hemophilia. When they're dealing with prophylaxis, they switch to prophylaxis when the use of on-demand treatment is similar to prophylaxis. Of course, there is a certain range of tolerance. It's not exactly number of vials in one and in the other treatment. But if you take a patient who is using one treatment per month, and you think of its benefit on using 8 treatments per month to avoid the single attack that he is usually having, of course, you have to consider the possibility that your approach is not optimal.
Right. Marco, let me just break in, just so we're clear. If there were one group or two groups that are currently active in this area, who are they? Who is the right clinical subspecialty to make the guideline that would help determine appropriate use of these treatments?
But you know that there is no subspecialty which is specific for HAE. I mean, in general medicine, there are people who are allergists, there are people who work in ENT. There is a wide variety of physicians. Some other is hematologist, maybe with experience on hemophilia. Mm-hmm. So there is a big variety. Right. And I think that the problem should be solved within the HAE community, right? Somehow.
Well, it's interesting. We did a report recently on treatments for amyloidosis, a hereditary form of amyloidosis, and the same issue arose. It's cared for by doctors in lots of different specialties, and so there's no one group that kind of views it as their responsibility to get out front and help create clinical guidelines. So one policy recommendation we might consider is to invite, there are patient organizations, right? Isn't there an international or at least a national patient organization? They hopefully can figure out a way to work, maybe even with the manufacturers, but to somehow pull together the clinical community to start to work on some of these issues, even if they come from lots of different specialties. In lieu of that, April, as a payer, you've been looking at your own data probably and trying to learn currently how you're caring for patients with HAE and thinking about the role of these new treatments. What have you learned from looking at your own data?
We did an analysis as Hegarda was coming to market, and it's available as a poster presentation that we presented. And what we found is that about 37% of patients are considered new starts, and so that means that they had not had a claim for drug for at least 6 months. So they may have had some drug at some point in their history before that, but we consider them a new start if there's a lag of at least 6 months.
So wait, I'm sorry, just so I'm clear. Haegarda for prophylactic treatment?
I'm sorry, any
Or
HAE.
any use? Okay.
Any
So
HAE
6
treatment.
months of nothing, but they were continuous members for 6 months?
They were continuously enrolled over a longer period of
And
time.
had no, and so 30% of the people on Haegarda had had no prior
This
treatment?
isn't, I'm sorry, this is any HAE.
Any HAE.
So
Okay.
whether it's on-demand, prophylactic, this was
Okay.
just as Haegarda was coming to market. So that was when we were
Got it.
really doing a deep dive.
Yeah.
So all drugs, all in, all HAE patients. Our prevalence was a little lower. We had about 1 in 66,000 patients with a diagnosis of HAE. And again, 37% of those patients were considered new starts, meaning that these are continuously enrolled. So there was a few more if you looked at just diagnosis, but they were not continuously enrolled. So we only looked at those that we had a long-term that we could look across their claims. And again, we see a high number of new start patients, which is indicating that a lot of our patients are not on this longer-term therapy, or they're using on-demand. We did find the most spend in Cinryze, and that would be for patients who are that have the potential to be using it for prophylaxis. And in digging into our data a little bit, we found probably only 25% of Cinryze patients overall were using it for prophylactic indications. So it seems to be at this point in time, and again, this was right as Haegarda was coming to market, so I don't have the current data with Haegarda, that a lot of the use is on demand. The other thing to note is almost 97% of our cost is in drug therapy. So when you look at the people who are actually going to a hospital or ED or engaging in other services, it's a very small percentage of the overall drugs or overall spend in general. 97% of it is being spent on these medications.
Right. Well, it just means that they're not in the hospital as much, at least
But it also
relative
leads-
to, it means that the drug spend is very high.
It means that the drug spend is very high, and that from a payer perspective, we're keeping them out of the hospital, which is a really great thing. Not arguing that point at all, but it just goes to show that the drug spend is of concern as a payer because of the costs. And we did see, I think, over 10 of these patients had spends well over $1 million per year.
How many, sorry?
10,
10 out of how many?
111.
Okay.
$1 million after Haegarda was introduced or before?
This was before.
All right.
Yeah. Using Cinryze, Berinert, Kalbitor, Firazyr, any of the above.
Yeah. So on demand.
Correct.
Right.
Yep,
Okay.
any.
Well,
Because
I'm sorry, go ahead.
prophylaxis was not the majority of our drug
Yeah.
spend, but Cinryze was the #1 drug contributing to drug spend.
So as we start to talk about the options for coverage therapy, feel free to jump in with how you think your view of what's been happening before or the population as you know it, the distribution of severity, the distribution of all these other things might come into play as people think through their options. So let's go ahead, because of the time, let's just jump towards some of the aspects that every payer will have to figure out when they're creating their coverage therapy for these prophylactic agents. So the first is just the diagnosis. So some coverage for some conditions requires a lot of effort to make an accurate diagnosis. Others just let the physician, doesn't even ask for a kind of a confirmation of the diagnosis. So, and there are 3 kinds of HAE, the 1, 2, and then the 3. So I'm just curious, maybe this is already something you guys have done, but do you think that payers will create diagnostic criteria related to blood testing to confirm that it's HAE 1 or 2? And if so, we'll talk about what happens to patients with 3. So what do you think about the diagnostic? What would have to happen for this drug to be approved from the diagnosis perspective?
Yeah, in our management strategy, we do look for a diagnosis of HAE 1 or 2 because that's where the drugs have proven benefit. And in speaking with manufacturers and others, there's not enough evidence to really support using the drugs in type 3 HAE. So we generally limit it to type 1 and 2. And we do ask for physician attestation at a minimum. Some of our health plans may be more restrictive and actually ask for lab values, but they are looking at C1 levels to see if they're either low or have a functional deficiency.
Right. And forgive me, I know you both know this, but I'll ask Deborah just to make sure we give you a chance to kick in. So remind me, the diagnostic aspect between 1 and 2 even, is that done through one specific blood test, or how would payers and doctors know?
A multimodality function to see if, one, your level is abnormal. If you
Right.
have symptoms and you have a low level and abnormal, that's a easier diagnostic conclusion. If you have symptoms that are consistent with HAE, but your level's not low, then you have to start doing functional testing to see if the protein that exists is not functional. And if that's not conclusive, then you start thinking about an alternative diagnosis, which is your type 3 diagnosis, which is HAE with a normal C1 level.
Right.
So there is a stepwise
There's a
approach.
stepwise approach.
And I would comment that in the United States, though I recognize from a global perspective, there's a big mix of specialists that really spend time and invest in treating HAE patients, but it's predominantly in the allergy immunology
figure.
community in the United States.
We were going to pick on them anyway. I think you're right. So
I have a question. Can I ask
yes,
a
sorry,
question?
Marco.
It's about, do you have an idea of the number of patients who have, of the percentage of patients who have just a functional deficiency among those for whom you pay for treatments? Is this a small portion or is it a relatively large portion?
I think he's asking you.
I don't know if you have these numbers.
By diagnosis, by 1 or 2?
Yeah.
No, it's, as long as they have 1 or 2, we approve it. I don't know that our data goes that deep.
Okay.
Because sometimes the functional assay is problematic, and subjects are diagnosed as C1 inhibitor deficient because they have low function when they're tested. When you look at the biochemistry of these patients, they really don't have C1 inhibitor deficiency because they have normal C4.
So
So I
again,
just-
is there a single test or a stepwise series of tests? Sounds like you just want the doctor to tick a box, hereditary angioedema. But other payers might say, I want the blood test to confirm that it's type 1 or 2. I want something because these are very expensive drugs and we want to target the patients who are most likely to benefit from them. So and again, Deborah, you may be familiar with how different payers are thinking through this question, but we like to lay out the different options that the payers are going to be considering. So I can't not imagine that there's going to be some way to specify a diagnostic criteria for this.
Well, I mean, I think that from a clinical standards and guidelines standpoint, that the criteria are in place. It then becomes a mechanism of having the documentation of the testing. Remember, these are inherited disorders, and so the source of the prescriber sometimes does not necessarily have the rooted original testing. And we see this with many other inherited disorders. So the question will then become, do you take away a diagnosis of somebody who has been given the diagnosis since their first, whether it be early childhood and so forth over time, and then continue to reburden the diagnostic criteria? Some of the challenges that have come up in the community is if you do that and somebody's already on prophylaxis, you're changing plans and then you're asking to reinstitute it.
Right.
You would then ask them to go through a washout period and so forth and risk attacks. And things that I think have not come up within the discussion at the panel, and recognizing that within the report, all of the data is very difficult, to express within this type of report, are true elements of morbidity that come with each of these attacks associated. Whether the attack's long or short is just one small component other than the secondary morbid condition that comes along with those. And that's whether there's pain, there's surgical intervention, other elements, and as we go to the serious levels of asphyxia, anoxic brain injury is not necessarily death, but nonetheless, it's a very morbid sequela.
So
these are pieces that all come into play.
Let's go there, because it's one of the, it's probably the next step. Well, I could talk about, let's talk about the doctors. So the way that insurance criteria are frequently written, it's the patient criteria. So we've talked a little bit about the diagnostic criteria. We'll get to the attack severity or frequency in a sec. Physicians, do you think that health plans are going to limit the prescribing to any certain subspecialty, or people who have an expertise in this area, or just somebody who's not a primary care doctor, or what?
At this point, we don't limit it to specialists, but to your earlier question, we do have diagnostic criteria within that. And so in general, what we're finding is that when you're requesting that kind of diagnostic criteria, most of the time they're going to some sort of specialist to get the diagnosis. But I do agree with CSL that we're careful about grandfathering patients. I mean, the objective of our criteria is really to manage new starts and to ensure that they're on appropriate therapy with an appropriate diagnosis.
Okay. All right, so should we go to attack frequency? So if these drugs cost $10, we wouldn't care. If every patient who had this condition had an attack every day, we wouldn't care. The fact that they're very expensive treatments, in the vast majority of cases, they're not life-threatening. They can be, but for most patients, they're not. And because there's a variation in attack severity, it becomes a really tricky clinical and economic and social and ethical question about whether and how to define some threshold for attacks to approve therapy, coverage for therapy. So how have you thought through that? Because there are no definitive guidelines. And again, this is where payers will frequently fall back on what clinical societies say, but in absence of that right now, what are you doing?
Our current stand is that we use what was mainly used in the clinical trials, which is 2 attacks per month as a baseline to go on to prophylactic therapy. And I think what we're trying to align is finding that balance, as Marco had spoken to, is the fact that if they're having such infrequent attacks at 1 a month, the burden of prophylaxis may not help with compliance or improve their quality of life or decrease some of their risk factors. When you hit that point where they're having 2 or more attacks a month, which is what the clinical trials looked at, that's where what we've been educated to is where there's a lot of other burden, as the anxiety and other things that go along with the disease state, where prophylaxis may be considered. So that's what we use in our criteria to determine prophylactic therapy.
Okay. What does the FDA label say? Nothing about attack severity, right? Or number, I should say.
Based on indication of requiring prophylaxis, and it's clinical discretion with respect to that.
So
but
one of the old, imagine the FDA says if a doctor says it's indicated, it's indicated. Don't see that too much anymore. Go ahead, you were going to say?
Well, I think that the concept that there are guidelines. I think that what the guidelines don't include is a threshold of attacks that triggers you to prophylaxis. And I think that that's a very important distinction, mostly because the experts have looked and said, if we look at scenarios, just as the panel had struggles with scenarios of low and intermediate and high, and there's issues around a lot of these topics to say, what are we going to commit to? Clearly, if you had a young child who had 3 laryngeal attacks and was on the brink of asphyxia in 1 year, that's less than 1 per month. But that child, many clinicians would believe it was appropriate to initiate prophylaxis. So I think that when the clinicians that see the mix of phenotype of clinical condition in this patient population, very, very difficult for them to feel comfortable with one particular number, irrespective of the financial burdens that go associated with that. And I understand that in this environment, with respect to a stepwise approach in thinking about what to cover, there are many attributes that come into that decision tree, and I think it becomes difficult to create the master tree with respect to that. And this is an area that over time, looking at how the utilization of these products are brought in and to support this community, maybe what eventually will evolve to some granularity as to who gets the most benefit and what are the decisions that triggered them.
Well, what's also difficult is, like anything else when you're talking about prophylactic therapy, how good the on-demand treatment works is critical. And you guys started asking those questions. How long does it take to get, to have the treatment work if it's used on demand? What are the real risks that something really bad will happen as long as you use the on-demand treatment as needed? Because that will also be part of the weighing of how best to create some kind
And
of
I think
threshold.
some of that data is available, and as many others have alluded to, the timing, as we looked at the clinical trials and we were executing the studies, trying to understand, because some of the studies had a placebo component, which essence meant they were on demand, and they transitioned to a true prophylaxis element. You can observe at the events and the issues related to those particular events that made them worse and more morbid. And that's it. Having immediate access to one recognition that you're at the beginning of attack, so whether you treat at the prodrome or during an attack. And then also the availability to administer the product.
Right.
And that timing difference makes a huge piece. And that variability is not insignificant. If you're driving someplace, do you stop driving? You may have to stop driving and to administer, irrespective of whether it's IV or sub-Q. If you're on a train, if you're on a plane, if you're moving through your day, these are all attributes that play a role for that on-demand component and have an impact on success of treatment and associated morbidity of the attack.
Right. So again, payers around the country are thinking, I'm writing my criteria, I'm probably going to put in some mention of attack frequency and or severity. I think most payers are likely to do that. I could be wrong. I could pick 1 and or severity. I could pick 2 and or severity. I could pick 3 and or severity. Just to note again for the record that the cost effectiveness that we saw it'll hinge hugely no matter what number you pick. But it was that range between 3.3 and 3.8 where things seem to go from what we would consider to be cost effectiveness in traditional terms to grossly not cost effective, keeping all the other kind of crazy variables comparable. So insurers sometimes face adverse selection. So let's say that your competitor picks 3 as the threshold for prophylactic therapy. Are you going to get all the patients? Are all the doctors going to say send them to Prime Therapeutics because they let you get it if you only have 2? Or they're a lot easier to get it? So is there a race to the top of this, if you will, the top in terms of a higher number of attacks per month? What do you think is going to happen in the insurance market as each insurer makes their own decision without there being a strong guidance from the clinical community?
I think that patient selection happens a lot more in the health insurance marketplace than in commercial benefits because the patient can go out and select their own benefit. And so in that case, I think the looser your criteria is in one sense, the more adverse selection you may have in your population. So I think as an insurer, we do try to look at the market and stay competitive or stay within the same basic lines in our criteria. Just because these are very high cost patients, but on the flip side, there's also the whole component of we do want to manage overall drug spend between medical and pharmacy.
Right,
and so there's always weighing one versus the other. Or again, if you're using, if you're a candidate for prophylaxis and you're using more on demand, that can be just as costly. So it's really trying to shake it all out to make sure that the patient's being they're being managed to their lowest cost, if you will. And what I can say is, from a Prime perspective, what we're really looking at is there's so few patients in general that have this condition. Like we said, 37% of new starts is less than 40 patients generally per year. And so that's where doing a high-touch pharmacy program where pharmacists or other professionals are reaching out to these patients and helping them, understanding what their needs are, and helping them find the best benefit for them through their pharmacy benefits could be advantageous. So we're exploring programs such as that.
I was going to ask you about that. But you raised something else that offered itself as an option for insurance coverage. Instead of trying to use number of attacks or severity, could you say, well, if they're using a certain amount of on-demand treatment, that could be the threshold? Because if they've been members for 6 months and they've never used on-demand treatment, and now they're put on a prophylaxis regimen, does that make sense? because we don't think that their attacks have been bad enough to require on-demand treatment. What's going on here? I mean, was any thought given to saying if you use 2 or more on-demand treatments in a month, as opposed to asking the doctor to certify a number of attacks? Or are you using on-demand treatment as a surrogate for attack?
At this point, we're looking more at the attack, the number of attacks.
But how are you finding attacks? Through the use of on-demand or through doctor's attestation?
Through the doctor's attestation.
Now, what do you think about using the use of on-demand as a surrogate or maybe a better outcome measure from which to measure the appropriateness of prophylactic therapy?
Yeah, it's something we definitely look at is the fact that we're looking that they have one on-demand and or a prophylaxis and trying to limit the use of multiple products as well.
Right.
So it gets really tricky in this space when there's so much crossover as well. It's not always clear when you're looking straight at claims to know if it's truly on demand versus a prophylactic therapy as well.
Right. You probably have an opinion about that. Have you heard of other payers using the use of on-demand, a certain threshold for that, instead of trying to figure out how many attacks or severity thereof?
I don't think with respect to access and saying yes or no, at least what feeds back into us, I do think that there is feedback loops about patients that have challenges with certain types of products, certain types of administration modalities, and how that translates, and seeing a very expensive on-demand patient converting to a less expensive prophylaxis patient. And we've had that feedback loop experience, which I believe is when subcutaneous therapy became available. There were many patients on demand who were not able to manage intravenous, self-administered prophylaxis twice a week well and consistently, were utilizing other on-demand modalities rather than the discipline of a sub-Q IV administration. So we've seen that variance, which I think has gravitated to sub-Q prophylaxis as a thoughtful advantage with respect to that on-demand type patient. But we haven't, if my other colleagues have had other feedback experience, I don't think in general we're getting the feedback that they're looking and saying we're going to count spend or expense and on-demand to convert those to sub-Q in a restrictive way to say you're not allowed to have prophylaxis because your on-demand spend wasn't enough.
Well, let me just spin that on its head. I could imagine a health system like Kaiser saying, let's use our data right now to find the people who are using a high level of on-demand therapy, and for some reason they haven't been put on prophylaxis. We want to go track these people down, talk to their doctors, and get them on prophylactic therapy. On the other hand, if we have people who are asking to start prophylactic therapy who seem to have a drip of on-demand therapy coming into it, maybe we want to have a chat with that doctor too about options for effective on-demand therapy. So I can see it working both
I believe
ways.
there's a lot of there's a lot of looking at those options now that options are available. And it's true if you have a high utilization on-demand patient, a prophylactic regimen could surely be beneficial on both sides, both clinically and from a cost standpoint, if you can prevent attacks.
So April, going to go out and, so you mentioned calling the doctors. And again, for ultra-rare conditions, that's sometimes one of the things that payers will do. They'll say, we don't want to try to write some kind of microscript, finely detailed criteria. We want to be able to talk to the doctor and say, have you thought about this? What's going on with this patient? And doctors don't always love that process, but at least it's one of the options that payers, at least payers, do consider. So.
Yeah, or even talking to the patients themselves. And
yes, you mentioned that. I'm sorry. That's really interesting.
So both the physician and the patients, but again, one of the options we're exploring based on the complexities that you brought up is the fact that if we were to take our really high-cost members or new starts and try to engage them in a system and monitor them as they're going through and give suggestions for when that might be cost-effective for them, for us, to switch over to a prophylactic therapy or a different convenience factor, that it may be worth the time and money, because anything that you save here, like a small swing, as we saw in drug pricing, makes a huge difference on the qualities.
Yep. Jeff,
I've actually got a question for Dr. Benson Kennedy, because I'm thinking about this, and as it comes into the frequency, And it's really kind of how drug companies make pricing decisions. So for example, if you could treat 20 patients at $50,000 a unit, or you could treat 50 patients at $20,000 a unit, you make the same amount of money, but there's a big difference in access. And so somebody has to make this decision on pricing, because usually pricing is a decision rather than having anything to do with the cost at some point. And then the other thing is we heard that there's sort of these thresholds that people look at, you know, if you were at $100,000 per quality, there's a whole bunch more enthusiasm about coverage. So how does these decisions get made? Because we come up with these expensive drugs. How do people look at it? Because it is like Steve said, if it was $10, everybody'd get it. If it's really expensive, we're going to say, well, there's some threshold around it. And I'm curious as to how what's the calculus there?
So being on the medical side, it's probably more difficult for me to make granular comments with respect to pricing strategies. But I can give you some holistic views, and my colleagues, if they want to add into that, I can ask them to comment. In general, I agree that when we look at price, added benefit to patients, what's available, we also have some unique elements within the scope of plasma-derived products, because the component of plasma-derived, there is plasma as a whole is a rare resource. So that's one piece, and we think about volume of product, dosing recommendations, and then also subsequent pricing associated with that. When Haegarda was brought to the market, it was brought at a discounted price to what was available for a number of reasons. One, we believe that we really could change the dynamic and prevention of attacks. We do make an on-demand therapy, but from our perspective, we believe that preventing attacks is most beneficial to patients in this space. And then that really translates to the greatest benefit of attack prevention, and the dose that was chosen of that then allows more access, and then eventually shifts the burden overall cost, because the on-demand components go down. So, I mean, I think that was our starting position. Our starting position was to bring it to market at a lower cost than what was available in the market, but also what came with that was added clinical benefit. And so we believe that that was an appropriate balance at that point in time. Also recognizing that our starting material is plasma sourced, and that in itself has its own balance within all of the plasma products that we generate. So I don't know if that completely answers all of our calculus, but it's clearly a piece of that. And then also when we did a dosing recommendation, our dosing and consistent recommendation was at our best and largest unit recommended dose, but also at price discount. So we didn't go for a very low dose that wasn't our most effective dose and then say, oh, we had a discount, but you're going to have to dose creep up to something to get the most effective element. We started at the most effective dosing position that we had within our scope of our clinical trial. That's what we requested for labeling. We received that, and it was priced accordingly, still at discount to what was available at the time.
Alex?
Is there any hope for generic versions of some of these medications, either the on-demand or the prophylactic?
I would say from a prophylactic monoclonal antibodies, there's surely the opportunity for biosimilars. And from a plasma-derived situation, I mean, you would have to go through the process of the plasma-derived source, which is a little bit different than standard manufacturing of recombinant factors and so forth. So I would say that that's a little bit different. Of course, there are other plasma-derived products over time that could join this market. But it's a little bit different than the biosimilar approach, I think, with monoclonal antibodies and recombinant factors.
All right, I'm going to go, I'm going to go really quickly through the next two questions. If you can be really quick, and then I have to go through a couple real quick bullets before we kind of move towards the final comments.
Okay, shelf life of the abortive or the acute medications. So April, and maybe Stephanie, you can talk about this too, because you did a look back for 6 months. Is it possible, if you have to carry it with you all the time, that you might have a vial from 2 years ago and it still works that you would be using? So how good would that look back be?
Our look back is for claims, and so we're just looking to see if people are consistently taking any medication. And so to your point, they may have drug that's sitting out there. I think most of these products have a shelf life or a expiration of about 1 year. If I'm not mistaken, for most infusible products, the FDA doesn't go beyond a year. I would have to ask the patients. I mean, we don't make patients keep it or not.
How many doses do you usually have? Like, and we know that people work with EpiPens will typically have like 3, at least 2 or 3 of them lying, in different locations.
Going with my doctor, speaking with him, when we order, we get 3 doses. And when we use 1, he wants us to go ahead and reorder just because we don't know when. So then we would be up to 5. And then when we get down to the 2, then we'll reorder again. So that's just what we had worked out with our doctor, is with our insurance, we get 3 doses. When you get down to 2, reorder, just because he doesn't want us to run out. So, yeah.
All right. Good. All right. So let me go through. This is going to feel, I don't know, what some TV talk show, rapid fire, whatever. A couple of points that I think are, again, going to be part of the thinking of payers when they create their coverage criteria. So at least I want to just hear your headlines for these. So one is the weight-based aspect. Some of these are weight-based in terms of their dosing. Should a payer say the maximum dose a patient who's 60 kilograms receives is the 60 kilogram dose, no more, and we'll figure out, the rest. So we keep doctors from overprescribing it by capping it at a weight base. And actually, for really heavy patients, fixed dose for some drugs might be the more cost-effective option, but even those may sometimes not be used in the fixed dose that's in the label. So how should payers think of the weight-based aspects of the dosing as a part of their coverage criteria in terms of how much to provide coverage for? April, maybe I'll ask you first if you've thought through this.
Yeah.
How are you using weight as a part of your coverage?
We actually do vial maximization in our criteria. So based on weight-based dosing, using 60 international units per kilo as the dosing there. And then we we actually limit how many vials of each dose, because there's multi-doses of the vials. There's 2,000 units, 3,000 units, et cetera. So we're really trying to keep it in a tight range because of the cost of this particular product. In talking with the manufacturer regarding the weight-based dosing, they have said that you round up or down to the nearest 500 units, and so that's what we allow for.
Okay, I was going to ask you that as a separate question, but thank you for weaving it in. So some payers, this issue of, I hate to use the word again, wastage, it's more the rounding up or down. So I would assume that some payers would say, we have an official coverage criteria that if you're within X percent or X kilograms of a specific dose of a specific target, you would use so many units, not break open another one just to get you up and beyond that. So that's what you've done.
Yep. And
do you mind sharing, is it an absolute difference around like a target, or is it a percent within the target? So if one vial treats to this weight and the person is just this much below it, above it, you don't want them to open up 2 vials.
We don't, but I'm not sure that our criteria, I'd have to look at it. I don't know that we're that selective. I think we're more, at this point, on the generous side, is that at 60 units per kilo, here's the number of vials you could get. So that could account for some potential waste, just in the sense that we don't want to necessarily limit below that. So the way our criteria is written is in dose ranges, what would
label,
follow. Yep,
right.
to the label, what
right.
it would follow and how many vials. But we do try to do the vial maximization to make sure that they're not getting higher doses of certain vials.
Okay, you probably have something you'd love to say, but I'm going to keep going. Here's a question that I'm sure the manufacturer's not here would love us to ask. Given that patients like sub-Q treatments more often, less risk of long-term scarring, should insurers, is there any reason to cover the IV anymore? Do patients need it? Do doctors need it? We've got C1 esterase inhibitor sub-Q. We've got the lanadelumab now sub-Q. So especially if they're trying to negotiate better prices, can not covering Cinryze be a clinically reasonable option? What do you think from the patient perspective? You've used both.
I've never used.
Oh, I apologize.
No.
You used IV.
I used IV Berinert.
For prophylaxis? Oh,
On
just
demand.
for on demand. Oh, okay. So you've never used the IV
I've never used
prophylaxis.
IV.
Okay.
No.
All right. Doc, okay, do you mind if I quickly pivot?
No, that's
Marco,
fine.
thank you for being patient. Are there any patients for whom you would need the IV prophylactic approach with Cinryze as opposed to the sub-Q?
I really don't see any category that could benefit of IV instead of subacute.
All right.
It could come up with someone that have a special behavior, but as far as my experience, I don't see that this is a major issue.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, there are other minutiae of a coverage policy that we could get into, but I'd like to kind of take a step back again to the big picture and invite the Policy Roundtable to consider if you had one takeaway point about the application of the evidence we've discussed today to the future in terms of coverage policy, pricing in the future, how patients are involved in research, whatever it might be. It doesn't even have to be something we necessarily have talked about. And frequently, if you want to frame that as an ask, you want somebody out there to do something in the future that would make the world a better place for innovation, for cost control, for patients. What would your reflection and maybe your ask be? April? And I'm sorry, I forgot one important caveat. Try to do it in one sentence with a big semicolon.
Yeah, I think as we're seeing more drugs come to market, just having appropriate pricing that falls into these ICER thresholds for quality is extremely valuable and keeps access open and makes management considerations easier.
Okay, now everybody see how she did that? Everybody? Not even a semicolon. Thank you. Stephanie.
Have patients have an input on what medication they're going to be using. Don't limit them to say, this is what you have to take. It may not be suitable for them. They may not want to do an IV. They may want to do sub-Q. There may be patients that don't want to do sub-Q that want to do IV. Just make it patient choice.
Okay, thank you. Brenda. Deborah, sorry.
I would say that the focus on prevention of attacks or prevention of morbidity of disease and the rare disease needs to be the new standard and start bringing the care of patients with deficiencies to the level of other major disorders like diabetes, in which we would not expect IV insulin to be the treatment of hyperglycemia, and to really bring people into a different level of expectation for their overall clinical care, and to take that perspective within respect to their care, then to trying to mix and match all those elements and what might work maybe reasonably well and is less expensive. Because good control of disease winds up leading to much longer term benefits.
Okay, thank you. All right, we will actually, you'll be able to stay, I hope, till 3 so that we can give you a nice round of applause then. What's that? Oh, for heaven's sakes, thank you. Marco, I have my back to you too much of this process. Please, you probably heard me encourage you to have a final statement with an ask of the community or a particular stakeholder that you would like. Go ahead.
What I see as a major need is to define benefit for patients based on patient groups. I think that we don't have any good data to define the different benefit that patient can receive from therapy when you consider the different groups of patients. And this is what we have to look for in order to have a good treatment.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so let's invite the CTAF panel as we go around. You may have a final statement. It can, again, be an ask of somebody or a reflection on today, how it connects either with other topics or something you'd like to see in the future. Jeff, do you mind if I start with you on this end, and we'll work our way to Paul?
I'm going to start with me. Wow, brave.
Yeah.
No, I think it's super interesting in that, this is a good example of something that's really uncommon but super important to treat, and it does get down to the fact that FDA approval, you get approved for the condition, and it's clear that not everybody is a candidate, and I think we need to get to the point of thinking about in the prescribing some kind of idea about not all patients are the same and some kind of thoughtfulness about it, because the FDA approval basically says that you can use it, but I think it really ought to be considered that who's the appropriate candidate. The flip side is, and I'll just put out again, if the price is down in in lower thresholds, it's going to get used a little bit more, and the price becomes less of an issue.
All right, thank you. Lisa?
I think the data I would like I'd encourage the manufacturers to continue to follow long-term. What is the efficacy of these? Does it quit working after a certain period of time? And what's the safety data? Because I think one of the things we struggled the most with was the lack of data in terms of benefit. So continued surveillance to know what the long-term benefit is.
Thanks. Alex?
This is the first time that I can recall I've been on CTAF when we've reviewed the evidence for an ultra-rare condition and treatment, and also I think in as far as I can recall, had the greatest uncertainty about the evidence, and I think those two are related, so I'm interested to see going forward as we review other ultra-rare conditions and treatments, how we make decisions in the face of that uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Okay, I'll be shorter than usual, but I would like to reiterate this is really getting very important with the rapid approvals going through FDA and the lack of actual meaningful data that we have to work with at this particular level, and that impacts patients because patients need the same amount of data to make appropriate decisions right now. My encouragement off the wall here would due course. I think the patient groups and the providers and socially the payers, I think we need to put more pressure on this wastage thing because it's not wastage, it's dosage. I think we're using the wrong term when we call it wastage. You're telling me there's a fudge factor, which I assume was built into the trial, according to what you alluded to earlier, which floors me, quite frankly, particularly with these low numbers in the trial. So there's quite a range in there, and there's cost savings in there. I assume we've done dose escalation, and I'm wondering now, since we have this fudge factor been there, if we've done dose reduction. And if there's potential for that in there.
All right, thank you. Felicia?
This is more of a global comment. So when I started reading the report and found 6,500 patients, wow, there are all these medications for 6,500 patients. And I think that says a lot about why we don't know enough about which is best, but that we've taken it on at all, I think, is commendable.
Good. Rena?
My first comment is that we have 2 drugs in the past 2 years, which are for the same indication, and both are very promising. And I hope that they have long-term follow-up and competition for lower price.
All right, thanks. Jeff?
These are my ICER reflections for today. Stories of Stephanie, wisdom of Solomon, gracefulness of grace. Each drug, more than $30,000 per month. Low value could be made higher value with a better price. Better access with a better price could be win-win.
Is that officially haiku or just?
I think the formal is sleep deprivation.
Joy?
2 short things. One is that having such lack of substantive evidence makes me itch. And I find it very hard to vote on things when there's really not very much there, not very much substance. The second observation is based on what evidence we do have and what price information we do have. If Haegarda became just a little bit less expensive, it will become clearly the cost-effective choice for a lot of situations, and I would really urge the manufacturer to think deeply about that.
Thank you. Bill?
Okay. Well, this is a fairly uncommon condition. It causes a great deal of suffering, and my concerns is that both the payers and the manufacturers should look at this as not only a preventative action, but also look at patient preferences in terms of how this is going to work in the real world in their lives. When we look at study data, we see a specific profile put on patients in those studies, And so it doesn't always reflect the real-world situation. So we want to make sure, moving forward, that, that it will reflect real world and patient preferences. And I think that's where you'll get the biggest bang for your buck.
Thanks. Kim?
This is a little tangential, but I think we're starting to make, not starting, we're making a lot of decisions off the models. And I think it would be neat in 3 or 4 years if we went back and looked at some of the models we made decisions on and seen how good they were, or how close some of the point estimates or the confidence intervals that we use for those point estimates are.
That's not fair.
Everybody else gets graded.
Robert.
I think today's data is a deja vu again. It seems as we're looking at new drugs coming down the pipeline ever more quickly with very similar quality of data sets, small numbers of patients, short follow-up, and almost never a head-to-head comparison, because if I'm a manufacturer, I don't want a 50-50 chance of losing in a head-to-head comparison. I think the patient advocacy groups and hopefully the FDA, Hope Springs Eternal, would demand better data.
Thank you. Rita.
Thanks. So I agree with a lot of the comments, and I think the summary is that we do need more evidence. I mean, we're looking at something that clearly could be very important, a very, disabling condition, but the trials are small, they leave a lot of questions, and we're talking about very high costs. So certainly, I would like to see a lot more patient-reported outcomes in the trials. We didn't see any. I'd like to see really quality of life, because we know that the model, and I think that's a great suggestion, Kimberly, even though I think the model's excellent, people are different than the models, and it's very hard to extrapolate from a 14-week trial in a selected population. So I'd like to see more evidence when we're first looking at it, and continued, as Lisa said, post-market evidence to really make the best use of resources and the best outcomes for our patients.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat.
I think today's discussion and the report really highlight the fact that the importance of patient contextual issues when it comes to these type of drugs, these ultra-rare drugs in particular. And that's why a lot of us were uncomfortable voting low, but those contextual issues did not override the poor quality information that we had from the trials and the high pricing. I would just like to suggest perhaps doing a look back of all of the studies that ICER has done, and what is the average N, what is the average duration, because I've been on this panel about a year, and it seems like we just keep coming up against the same thing. So maybe having a comprehensive recommendation around the actual expectations for trials. I don't know if you've written something like that, but I think that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Annetta.
Yes, so I think a lot of this has been said already, but obviously the really high price of these drugs and the uncertainty around their effectiveness in the broader population of patients in which we would expect this to be used if there was no regulation for, or no criteria put together by the insurers, I think is highly problematic, and I'm concerned that we can already see in the data from the trials that there is a lot of fluctuation in attack frequency. So they're requiring 2, but the average attack rate was 3, 3.3, a little higher than 3. In one trial, the placebo group dropped down to 2, and the other one, it actually went up to 4 over very short periods of time. And then April is telling us that, quite a large number of patients are not even using any, or not refilling at least, their abortive therapies. And what I worry about is that payer is going to get stuck making some sort of policy with all this uncertain information, and that we could learn a lot by taking a broader look, as Marco was saying, I won't even try to pronounce your last name, that just getting a better perspective on what the selection bias is and how representative these patients are, and encouraging the manufacturers to try and look, at least in open label fashion, some sort of parallel design or, even a short crossover, what it looks like if you give these drugs to patients with much lower attack frequencies or without these severe attacks.
Thank you very much. Paul.
Yeah, I'd say rather than resign ourselves to these tiny trials with these uncommon conditions, I think we need to go forward with coverage for evidence development by the payers, wherever that's possible, for the patient advocates to be saying, to be pushing for more studies, and a culture change where you'd say to your spouse, why are you not in a study, as opposed to why are you in a study?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's good. All right, thank you. So first, I would like to thank our Policy Roundtable. Dr. Ciccardi, who is now up very late, sitting in his bedroom or living room in Italy and having wrestled with our technological gaffes all day long. April, thank you very much, from Prime Therapeutics. Stephanie, bringing the patient perspective, which is always, and your experience with it, both as a mother and as a patient yourself, was really, really helpful. And Deborah, thank you for the engagement throughout the review process and for you and your team being here today. So let's all thank the Policy Roundtable. So just to jump on briefly with my thoughts after yours, this really is, I think, fairly remarkable that this small, ultra-orphan is this kind of term that people bandy around. We decided to try to codify it at 10,000 patients. That's not an official number anywhere except in our heads. But this is 6,500 patients, and they're getting innovation that is bringing sub-Q treatments, which will really improve, I would think, in some ways, their quality of life. Prophylaxis, which is a great advance, it would seem, potentially. But the evidence issues being what they are, again, with this small patient population, it is hard to get large numbers enrolled. I mean, we can always hope for more, but this is what you're going to find with ultra-rare conditions. And at least we had some randomization and we had some aspects to be able to go on there. It would always be preferable if the outcome measures were the same in the different trials so we could compare things head to head. But the other thing that really, among all the different variables that we've talked about around which cost effectiveness hinges, just imagine this drug, as you said, it costs over $30,000 a month for prophylaxis. The only way it's even remotely possible for this to be cost effective is because the on-demand treatment is not cost effective. I mean, very, very few patients, it's a quality of life issue, but if we spent this level of money and it's getting innovation, and maybe that's part of the argument is that you need these kinds of prices and profits to get people to come into this kind of space with a small patient population. But as our science creates more and more treatments on more narrow patient populations, and we price them, if we keep pricing them this way, and we build a platform of the next price off of a baseline of really high cost, we're digging ourselves a grave. We might think we're digging it a little bit slower if it's cost effective, but it's still going to be a real problem. And think of the thing that patients would want most. How about a cure, right? A one-time cure. So the cost effectiveness of a cure would be to take that prophylactic cost of $30,000 per month and add it all up for the rest of a patient's life and put that all together as the price for a cure. And I doubt that that's something that we think our healthcare system can sustain. So my hope is that innovation can continue, that we can actually view innovation not requiring the level of pricing and the cost effectiveness. It's better to bring it down. That will all get us farther down the road. But ultimately, I really do hope there can be a partnership between industry, payers, and society so that we can figure out how to build a platform for future innovation that doesn't require us to build off of treatments that are clearly not cost effective at their starting point. So that will be something that we will continue to talk about and to wrestle with. But thank you again today to those of you in the audience and to the CTAF panel. You guys, thank you for your deliberation, your careful consideration and discussion of all the issues. So the meeting recording is going to be posted to our website next week. For those of you who want to see all those technological problems over again, you can do that. The final report is published on or about, nothing precise about that, November 15th. It will include a kind of an encapsulation of everything we've tried to talk about in the votes, et cetera. And it'll be available on our website for eternity. So we may be back in this space. You never know if there's a new paradigm shifting treatment available. We hope that there is. We hope that patients in the healthcare system will be able to afford it. And I just want to thank you again for your participation today. Thanks to the ICER research team and the logistical team that helped put on today's meeting. Have a good day.